We are starting our new series today on answering what is oftentimes called the problem of evil. How can God, or a good God, allow so much suffering in the world? As we go through the series, you'll find that this question is asking the wrong question. Even the word allow is a bit of a misnomer. However, I wanted to ask the popular level question that everyone always asks, which is, why does God allow evil? Even though I don't think that's a proper question to ask. Oh, no, you're good, Ed.
I like the way you walked out. I'm walking all the way around the other end of the church.
You're good, you're good. So, we're going to start answering this question. This is, I am planning, and we all know how my plans go. I'm planning on making this a 7-week course altogether. So it should be about 7 weeks. And Eliana is asking the very question right now, why is there so much suffering? I just want to sit on mom's lap and eat yogurt. That's all I wanted. So the problem of evil and suffering is not just dealing with sin, right? Because we can answer that, right? People sin. We can talk about that. But it's not just asking the question, why is there sin? The question is also, why is there even suffering? Why is there what we call natural evil? And why is there even moral evil, which is, of course, where the sin comes in. So here's the reality. How many of you guys have had to deal with what we call the problem of evil in your life? Okay, that makes sense. We've all had to deal with it. Now, just so you guys know, the problem of evil, the acronym is sometimes called POE or PO, okay? Just because in the philosophy world it becomes a lot easier to acronym things than to just go problem of evil, problem of evil. It just becomes redundant, okay? So I will sometimes refer to as the POE or the PO. Also, since we all deal with it, this is also, I want you guys to understand, this is an argument from the problem of evil. So what happens is a lot of times is atheists attack Christianity and say there's no way Christianity can be true because if there's such a good God, there wouldn't be so much evil, right? Because why would God create a place with so much suffering and evil? And you guys can see the logic. So what they do is they argue from evil against Christianity. Does that make sense? Also, it's what we call the problem of evil and suffering. No, you're good, Megan. You're good. It's only because I like you, though. Brandon, no, there's no grace.
Make sure to tell him that when he comes in.
I will gladly tell him that when he comes in. Where was? Oh yeah. The other thing is the problem of evil is what we call an internal critique. Now, guys, just so you guys know, I'm using technical terms, but I will explain what they are throughout, so that way you guys are properly equipped as we go forward. Also, these are all recorded, so you can always refer back. Okay. So it's what we call an internal critique of Christianity. So in other words, atheists aren't saying that they have to deal as much with the problem of evil in this sense, because they're saying it's internally inconsistent with Christianity. That's what they're saying, okay? So it's an internal critique of our system. That's what they're trying to do, okay? So that's kind of the idea with the problem of evil. So atheists, and I'm going to shoot straight here because I hope that you guys are my people, but I think in general, atheists really don't have many arguments against theism. But one argument that they do have is this one, and they have used it for centuries, which is, of course, the argument from evil. Does that make sense? So this is one of the big ones that you'll hear. Also, a lot of this, I want to give credit where credit is due. The main outline of this is from the president of my seminary, which is Dr. Braxton Hunter. I use a lot of his outline for this, so I want to give credit where credit's due in here. Then I added my own flavors throughout, things that I thought should be added, but I use at least his outline because it helps. If somebody already did a bunch of the work for you, why do more, right? So sometimes the path of least resistance causes less suffering. So, what to expect in this course on the problem of evil here at Frontline? What should you expect? Because today's is going to be mostly an overview and just kind of setting things up. Yes?
And especially when you said, how can God allow? They always say, how can a good God allow?
Right.
They have that.
Because they're trying to make sure that they're going after the moral character, right, of this God, and saying that ours is inconsistent. So again, for those who were not in here beforehand, problem of evil, acronym is PO or POE. Okay, I will use that throughout. So an overview of the lay Christian attitudes toward the POE. So that's one thing we're going to look at. We're going to look at the lay Christian's response to it. So if I were to ask most Christians today, hey, what are some things how would you answer the problem of evil? We're going to look at some of their views, and we're going to look at those today. Other things that you can expect in this course is things like the explanation of what we call atheist incoherent arguments. So there are arguments that are incoherent, used against us. And many arguments that atheists use are under what we call incoherent arguments, okay? Arguments that are essentially nonsensical. Also, we're going to explore the Epicurus paradox, what we call the Epicurean paradox. He's a Greek philosopher. And that's his argument for the non-existence of God. And we're also going to look at, and by the way, many arguments for God, against God, I should say, many arguments against God and for God are actually centuries old. So a lot of the stuff we're talking about today is not new scholarship. It's stuff that people have been arguing about for 2,000 years, and then some, okay? So we're also going to explore what we call theodicies. How many of you guys have used that word? Theodicy? Okay, theodicy, what in the world is a theodicy anyway? We will cover that, but that's going to be an extremely important class for you to be in. We're going to start covering those next week. Exploration of the logical argument from evil, we're going to discuss that. Either logical or what we call evidential, using evidence. Also, exploration of the problem of hell. We will be talking about the problem of hell. And what's the problem with hell anyway, guys? That people go there, right? Like, that's a pretty big problem. We should probably talk about the problem of hell. Also, we want, at the end of this course, we will do a quick exploration of what we are called the atrocities of the Old Testament, okay? We'll cover that a little bit. Not as much time on that subject as I would like, but I do plan to do a whole separate series in the future on just the atrocities of the Old Testament, what are oftentimes called that. So, but honestly, what we'll cover that day will be a good running start. So, guys, I want you guys to remember that this class on the problem of evil is a philosophy class. Okay? That's what this is going to be. So if you're like, well, he didn't have us open our Bibles. We're at a Bible church. I'm assuming that we already are agreeing on the Bible. The problem isn't the Bible in this question. The problem is the implications of evil and suffering in the light of the God of the Bible. Does that make sense? So this is going to be a philosophy class. It's not going to be historical. It's not going to be exegetical from the Bible. And I just want you guys to know this. In my heart, I am a Bible-thumping, hard-nosed, former Baptist pastor. I love the Bible, okay? So I love the Bible. We need to be careful, though, not to respond to philosophical objections with scriptural ones. Have you guys ever seen people do that? Someone brings in a really good philosophical objection. They go, well, Psalms says this. Well, the person doesn't even have a reason to believe Psalms at all. So even though it might be true, it's not going to be helping the situation because you guys are going to be speaking right past each other. Does that make sense? So, and again, I'm a hard-nosed, Bible-thumping pastor. So, but I want us to make sure we're good with that. Also, if all you do is continually appeal to that, like, oh, the Bible, the Bible, the Bible, and you're talking to somebody who doesn't believe the Bible, all you're doing is what we call circular reasoning, right? And we want to avoid circular reasoning. It's not a good defense of the faith, and especially nowadays when people are starting to call Christians out more and more on it. Okay? So, does that make sense? That's going to be what we're going to cover in this entire course. Hopefully we get it done in 7 weeks. And if not, we will see. So, what are some poor Christian attitudes towards the POE? So, a lot of Christians, and I'm just going to be honest with you, are really bad at answering. In fact, some of these I'm going to go over with you are going to probably bring a chuckle to you because you're going to say, I've said that probably before, or I've had somebody say that to me before. Does that make sense? So, here's some. Does pain and suffering represent God's judgment for sin? I hear this regularly. Think about it. How many of you guys were alive to remember 9/11? Okay. Do you guys remember how many Christians were wildly saying that this is God's judgment on America? So suddenly evil and suffering happens and they give the speculative answer, well, it's just the suffering in this world is just God's judgment for sin. That is not a good answer to the problem of evil and suffering. So, unfortunately, many Christians and pastors will be extremely outspoken, saying things like 9/11 were due to God judging the USA for things like abortion and homosexuality. But the thing is then why wouldn't God just judge the abortion clinic or the pride parade? It doesn't really make a lot of sense, right? So it doesn't make sense. So also there is, and we do know that there is direct judgment from God, and there is what we call passive judgment from God. So a direct judgment would be something like what happened to Sodom and Gomorrah, right? Just nuked from the face of the earth. And then there's what we call something more passive or indirect, which is the natural ramifications of living in sin, right? So it's not God, like for example, if you choose to go cheat on your spouse, well, and then your whole family unravels and you have all those problems. Well, is that God judging you? No, it's the natural ramifications of you falling into sin, right? So therefore, now you suffer the consequences. So that's different. So is there something God is trying to teach you every time something happens? Every time something negative happens, is that God trying to teach you something? Or is sometimes do just bad things happen? I'm of the opinion that sometimes bad things happen, we can learn from them, but I don't think God's causing all the bad things. I think that causes actually some serious problems within God's character. The other thing is suffering a call always to repentance. Just because you're suffering doesn't mean that you have to repent of something. Before you say yes, think of Job. Did Job do anything wrong? No, but he suffered a lot. What did he have to repent from? Nothing. It's kind of the point of his story. What?
Still does it though.
Still what?
Job still repents though.
He does, but he does his worshipful, right?
Just in case, yeah.
There's always, so honestly, right, as Christians, there's always a call to repentance. There's always a call to repentance, but suffering doesn't mean it's a call to repentance. So just because something evil happens does not suddenly mean is God judging. So this whole speculative, does pain and suffering represent God's judgment for sin, is a bad answer to the problem of evil. The other one is what I call the dismissive, which is what I like to call Christian cliches. We've all seen this. All right, so somebody loses a loved one, something horrible happens in their life, and what do we hear? Well, God's got a plan. Well, what kind of dismissive nonsense is that? You know, my child just died and God's got a plan. I don't care what his plan is. My child died, right? That's not a good answer. Plus, you're saying that it's God's plan that he inflicts evil upon you. Even in the book of Job, who's doing the inflicting? Satan. It is not God. Okay? So it doesn't make the person suffering feel any better, right? The person would just be like, well, change the plan, God. I don't like it. That's not okay. Also, this one, we've all heard this one. I'll be praying for you. Thoughts and prayers. It's not a good answer. Now, it's okay to say you're praying for somebody if you are going to pray for them. I've actually been really getting in the habit of when somebody tells me something and they're confiding in me going, I want to pray for you either right now or saying I will pray for you. And then as soon as that conversation is over, I pray. And it's because I don't want to say I'll be praying for you as some cliche, nonsensical, soft deflection, right? It's not helpful. And again, so don't be dismissive. If you're going to pray for them, actually pray for them and then seek to help them. Okay? So empty prayers are empty prayers, but prayers with action really can do something in somebody's life, right? So, and sometimes it's just shooting them a text. Hey, how's that situation working out for you this week? Actually, this conversation right now reminds me that there's somebody I need to talk to today. So, there it is. But everything happens for a reason. That's another one, right? Well, everything happens for a reason. That's also dismissive. That's just as bad as God's got a plan. Everything happens for a reason. Yeah, sometimes the reason is that somebody drove their vehicle while drunk and intoxicated and killed your child or killed your spouse, right? There's not a righteous reason there. It's something that is straight wrong or unjust. And it's okay for Christians to just acknowledge that, right? We don't need to spiritualize and punt everything to mystery to God. We can just say that that's something that is evil and wrong. We should talk about that. So, and the thing, when someone says everything happens for a reason, my first response is, does it? Are some things random or are all things caused? Does God cause all things? And I want you to think about that question before you answer it. Does God cause all things? Because if so, we have some serious problems to deal with, right? Because that would mean he causes things like rape and horrible other atrocities. So, and this is where, and that's actually one of the big problems that that puts me in juxtaposition to our Reformed brethren, which we will probably talk about that at a future time, because they believe all things are caused by God, right? That's all decreed by God, which is problematic. So this should be, this is another one. So someone dies, right? We've all seen this. Someone dies, and it was a tragic or whatever. I remember about 5 years ago, my mother-in-law passed of cancer. You know, she was 53 years old. Dominic right now is living with us. He was 11 when she passed, 8 when she got cancer. And when she died, once in a while we'd hear, well, this should be a time to celebrate. They're in the arms of God. You should celebrate. But grieving is good. Okay, so that's a dismissive Christian response to it. Grieving is good. Perhaps telling them you love them and are here for them if they need to talk is probably just better response than trying to spiritualize it, right? People are allowed to be sad when they lose someone, and we see that in Scripture. That's the whole, like, they rent their clothes, cover the body in ash and sackcloth. It's okay to grieve, okay? It's okay to grieve. They might not be seeing them for a long time, right? Because you might be like, oh, but you'll see them one day. Yeah, but that's not for a long time. I have to go a long time without seeing my spouse or without my loved one, right? So, I'm going to be sad because, I will see them, but not for a while. I remember even when I had to first go back to work after my daughter was born, I was kind of sad that morning when I had to leave and go to work, and that's just for 8 hours, you know? Let alone a lifetime, right? Or, decades. So, like when you leave, so I just want you guys to think about that, some of those Christian dismissive things. Here's another one. Sorry, it makes me laugh just hearing about it. I know what you're going through. Right? Have you ever been told that and then instantly wanted to hit someone in the throat when they said that? Because here's the thing. On paper, it could be the same, right? Both lost child. However, you're two totally different people. And maybe the ages were different. Maybe the situation, circumstance was different. Now, you guys have a similar thing you grieved about, right? But it doesn't make it the same. So instead of saying something like, I know what you're going through, but remember the same experience again. So maybe you should say, listen to them, hear them out, and go, let me share with you what I went through and what helped me. That's what I'll tend to do because I've been through some stuff. It's like, hey, let me tell you what I've been through and what helped me. And I don't know if it's going to be of any help to you, but just know I'm really sorry for everything and I love you. And sometimes that's all someone needs, and just know the fact that they have someone they can confide in about the situation, who's not going to judge them, who's not going to put them down for having difficult thoughts, okay? Because the problem with suffering is real. It'll all work out in the end. That's another cliche. It'll all work out in the end. Well, yes, we will all go to heaven, right? All the believers will go to heaven. So yes, it'll all work out in the end. However, it might not be the end of all things, but this doesn't deal with the issue at hand. Why does God allow this to happen? That's going to be what these people are going to be thinking. And again, even the term allow is a misnomer, but we'll talk about that. So does everything work out in the end without pain and suffering? No, absolutely not. We all have pain and suffering. So again, let's not address that. Let's address that properly. And so those are some of the cliches. So we have the speculative, it's all God's judgment. We have dismissive cliches. It's not helpful. But guys, the problem of evil and suffering is very real. And we Christians, it's one of the few things that are against Christianity. And we have to know how to respond to it. Does that make sense? We have to know how to respond to it. Because there's a lot of evil and suffering in the world. How many of you guys are familiar with this picture? How many of you guys are not familiar with this picture? All right, so let me quickly give you the upswing on it. This was thought to be a little girl. It's actually a little boy starving. And this photographer, this caused all sorts of problems in 1993, by the way, when this picture was released. Because allegedly, the photographer, Carter, he waited for the vulture to get close to the child before he snaps the shot and then chases the vulture away. So he sat there, and what it is that this child is clearly starving. The parents were going to a food bank down the road, and they left the kids there, and then the vulture was waiting for the child to die so he could eat it. This is a starving child, a real picture, and this guy, in 1994, won an award for this photograph, and within 4 months he committed suicide. You can imagine.
At the end, what did you say?
The guy who took the picture, in 1994, he won an award for this picture, and then 4 months later, he committed suicide. Yeah. So, you're dealing with that is suffering. This is, And this is the stuff when we're dealing with, like, well, why do Christians have to deal with it? Now, I've studied this out enough to go, I don't think the problem of evil is actually a huge problem against Christianity, but I think we have to know how to respond to it once someone looks into it. So, the most asked question I hear, why does God allow such suffering in the world? Okay, that is the most asked question I get. Because most people like the idea of believing in God because it gives them what we call hope, right? So we have to warn people all the time that your air-conditioned American situation is very different than what is going on in other parts of the world, and we should take it seriously. Do not brush it off with dismissive, I'll pray for yous, okay? In a cool moment, maybe this afternoon or sometime, seriously consider how people reconcile God's nature in the face of pain, okay? And in the midst of tragedy is usually not the time to also give a philosophical defense, because that's what this class is going to be, right? Someone's suffering and you want to give a philosophical defense, probably not the best time, okay? Just empathize with them on a human level, okay? And then when the wound is less fresh and they're trying to reason their way through it, then talk to them. Because have you noticed when something raw happens, people have a strong emotional response. So coming to a logic isn't going to necessarily always help, right? So they're having a strong emotional response, and then after a while, they start trying to reason it together, right? Try to piece it back into their life. That's when you can come in with the philosophy, okay? However, you're going to get asked questions, especially by angry people who believe that to be a Christian is crazy because of the evil and suffering, okay? So, and these are those people that we want to be equipped for. So, in the midst of tragedy is usually, again, not the time to give a philosophical defense, but an empathetic ear. Not unless they are actually attacking God entirely and saying God cannot possibly exist and let this happen. Then you might want to broach the topic, right? Be like, well, hold on, I think we haven't thought this through. And of course, that's kind of what you want to do. Hey, I don't think we thought this through. You don't want to be like, you're an idiot and you haven't thought this through, you moron, right? That's not the way you want to approach it. Christian philosophers and apologists cannot solve the emotional problem of pain, but we can handle the philosophical problem. Does that make sense? Because the emotional issue is always going to be there. However, if you propose God and you show the fact that He is a God and a Father who loves you and will comfort you and shows grace, that is something that can help with the emotional problem. However, a philosopher, an apologist, and a theologian cannot handle the philosophical problem. Does that make sense? I mean, the emotional problem. We can only handle the philosophical. We can only show the fact that it's not contradictory. Okay? That's it. So that there is what this class is designed to do. This is, okay? So, how much time? Oh man, I'm making good time. I'm so proud of myself right now. I was like, I'm going to get stuck. Also, feel free to interact and ask questions. This does not have to go for 7 weeks. If we have to push one off, I'd rather us really flesh some of this out and really have a good understanding as a church than to be done within a certain amount of time. Does that make sense? Okay. So, all right. So, and if you attempt to try to solve the emotional problem with a philosophical problem, just saying, you might get slapped in the face, metaphorically or physically. Okay, so be careful. And I'm saying that I'm preaching to myself on this because I have a tendency to have the decorum of a bull in a china shop. Okay,
Me too.
so I have that kind of personality. But most asked question again is the one that we just dealt with: why does God allow so much suffering? So now let's quickly take a moment to address what we call incoherence arguments. So these are arguments that are levied against Christianity to say that our view is incoherent, okay? So let's talk about that for a minute. Let's get off the depressing train and let's move on and switch our brains over to a philosophical world, and this will be a little bit easier, okay? I just want to make sure we set the tone properly before we just go, all right, I'm here to learn. No, there's a real reason why we're trying to learn, okay? So this here, incoherence arguments against Christianity, are the best atheists can do against Christianity, okay? An incoherent argument, okay? So when you go, what in the world is an incoherent argument? An incoherent argument is simply this. It's an argument which is designed to demonstrate that some aspect of theism or belief in God is incoherent or inconsistent, okay? So, There's a couple in the philosophy world. There's what they call the omnipotence paradox. Omnipotence, of course, means all-powerful, and a paradox is something that seems like it's a contradiction, right? So the omnipotence paradox. Can God create a rock so big he can't lift it? How many of you guys have ever been asked that question before? And it's always that one as a kid, when I first was asked it in my head, I could just almost exploded because I was like, yes. But here's the problem with what we call the omnipotence paradox. This is what we call an incoherent argument. Because what you're doing is you're creating two incoherent things. Could God create a rock so big he can't lift it? And you're trying to make omnipotence contradict itself. But the problem is that it's a nonsensical argument. God can create rocks, and he can create big rocks, and he can lift anything. So you're creating an incoherent argument, okay? It's like, think about it, like if I was like, the water, actually, no, it's not a good argument because someone's going to get smart on me. Yes, I have Micah in this class, I have to be careful. So, a better argument would be something like this. Can I, as a good person, and say I'm good, commit evil, and then say I'm still good? Well, no, right? Because if I'm good and I commit evil and I'm like, oh, I'm good, you're like, that's incoherent. It's like saying the same thing, that God can do two incoherent things, right? You're setting two things against each other, that just is incoherent. Also, but this is what they're going to ask, right? Stuff like that. Or omniscience paradox, which is omniscience means all-knowing. So do you know something God cannot know? And we'll talk about this example later, but an example that atheists will use is, Dwayne, you're in the class, I'll use you. Dwayne, you know what it's like to be Dwayne Huff, right? But God knows what it's like to be God. Mostly, you know, if you had the coffee. But God doesn't know what it's like to be Dwayne Huff because he's not Dwayne Huff. So you know something that God cannot know. Right off the bat you go, what kind of, so, and Paul, that face was the face I made. What? So these are the kind of arguments that are the best arguments against Christianity in many ways. And it's just because, and what it is you can tell, it creates an incoherence problem. And the problem is because you're asking an incoherent question. Does that make sense, Jordan?
Yeah. So your omnipotence paradox, the one that I use to counter that is, show me a scientist who can create a square triangle or a round a round triangle or a triangular, circular, circle, whatever. Then I'll believe in science. That's what you're saying. Show me a guy who can make a rock so big that he can't move it, and then I'll believe in God. Well, show me a scientist who can create a round triangle, and then I'll believe in science.
Right.
So you're asking God to do something that is logically contradictory.
Right, or show me a priest who can create a married bachelor, right? It's the same idea. It's an incoherent contradiction within itself.
Yeah, it's a logically contradictory view of the omnipotence of God.
Right, which is why when it comes to things like omnipotence, because people think all-powerful means he can do anything, right? But God can't create square circles. He can't create married bachelors because they're incoherent. God is a coherent being, right? And especially because we refer to him as a God of order, well, he's going to have order and structure to him. So we have to be careful here. So these are some of the things that we are going to broach more and more as this class goes on. Okay, we're going to discuss these at a deeper level, like you said, with like the square triangles, and it's nonsense, right? So we have to make sure we call that out, and we know how to respond to that. So here's the other thing. So how do we know that something is true? That's a good question, right? How do we know something's true? Well, what we have there's a couple theories of how truth works. We have what we call the coherence theory of truth, which is something is true if it is coherent. That's not a good way to go fully, right? Because the Lord of the Rings is within itself coherent, right? It doesn't make it true, all right? So it was like I had the Ring of Power. I was marching to Mount Doom. So coherence theory of truth isn't, most people, for obvious reasons, have abandoned it, okay? Then there's what we call the correspondence theory of truth, which is something is true if it actually corresponds with a fact of reality, right? And that seems a little bit more plausible. Like, okay, does this reflect reality? Yes. Okay, I have a stronger belief that this could be true. However, a proper understanding of truth corresponds with reality and is coherent. Okay? So the problem is people come in here with an either or. It's really a both and, right? It should be coherent and it should correspond with reality. Does that make sense? So some believe they can hold to correspondence theory, but that truth doesn't have to be coherent. There are people who believe that. And that's just blatantly untrue, because if something is incoherent, then how can you really know it, right? Because if it's unknowable and it's completely contradictory, it's nonsense. And to quote C.S. Lewis, nonsense is still nonsense even when it's about God, right? So maybe you should have a coherent view. How can, and then also, if something is incoherent, then how can we even test what is true if it's incoherent, right? Incoherent things can exist. And that's true. Well, then how can I even test it if it's incoherent? Because then I have no way to be able to justify that. And in our postmodern world today, that is becoming extremely popular, right? Remember, I mean, think about it. We have men can be women, or gender is just a social construct, but at the same time we say, well, lesbians are a thing, gay people are a thing, and bisexuals are a thing, but don't think too deeply on this, because underneath it all, they all contradict each other and incoherent, right? And postmodernism is this idea of subjective truth. That truth doesn't have an objective anchor to it. And it's basically whatever you feel. Am I making sense here? Okay. And postmodernism is a real problem, and we're living in that age. And what's funny is postmodernism, even though it's all about subjectivity, no one's really a postmodernist when it comes down to it, because there's always something that they don't find to be subjective, right? Mm-hmm. So you just find their pet topic, and suddenly they're going to talk like they believe in objective reality. So one of those conversations is like that of abortion that we've had a pretty large series on recently. So anyway, atheists can claim a perfectly good and all-powerful God with suffering existing is incoherent. That's the whole point of what I'm talking about here. That's what they're trying to say. A perfectly good God is incoherent, so it doesn't cohere with reality, and so therefore, if it's not coherent, well then we don't care what it corresponds to, right? It doesn't matter. So the whole point of this introduction here is that's what atheists claim, that a perfectly good and all-powerful God with suffering existing is incoherent. They will also say that what we call in this world the burden of proof, maybe you've heard that phrase before, the burden of proof is on the Christian. And the question is why? Well, because they will say something to the effect of, you cannot prove something that doesn't exist. You can't prove a negative. How many of you guys have heard that statement before? You can't prove a negative, right? We've all heard that. So they assume God does not exist, right? So they already have a presupposition. God does not exist, and you cannot prove a negative. So if he does not exist, you can't prove that because it's a negative. So you cannot prove that something doesn't exist. This, however, is false if it's incoherent. So let me talk about this. Let me give you a little bit of a response here. You can prove that certain things don't exist, okay? This whole idea of you can't prove a negative, I think, is false. Because then it just continually begs the question that anyone can really believe in anything, because, well, if it doesn't exist, because, well, you can't prove a negative, right? So if you can prove something doesn't exist, if it is entirely incoherent, right? I can prove something doesn't exist, and this is where I was going to talk about what you brought up, but we got into it earlier, but that's fine. You can prove that married bachelors don't exist. Why? Because it's incoherent, right? You can't be married and a bachelor. You can't create square circles. That's incoherent. You can prove that doesn't exist. If I said something like this, there are no married bachelors in the entire universe, does this mean that I, Will Hess, have jumped on a spaceship, traveled across far and wide the entire universe and more, come back and reported to you that everywhere I looked there was not a single married bachelor? No. What it does mean is that this is an incoherent issue, so I don't need to do that, right? So when somebody is saying things like, well, you can't prove a negative because God doesn't exist, I would say this is an incoherent issue because if you guys remember at the very beginning of our unApologetics class, we went through some classical arguments for God's existence, and we have good reason to believe God exists. So it's not a negative. In fact, we have a strong case. So they need more than just saying you can't prove a negative. Because also, don't get lost in this game. So atheists will say, you're making a claim. God exists. Prove it. Right? We've all seen that. They say that all the burden of proof is on us. However, they also have a belief, which is God doesn't exist. And so my response can be, prove it. See the issue? They're making a claim too, but what the problem is that so many of them will try to put the burden on the Christian and then walk away and just try to get you to chase your tail and say, see, I don't have to prove anything. You have to prove it. No. We both have to prove our beliefs, or at least have reasons for our beliefs. Does that make sense? So, when we're talking about the problem of evil and the evidential problem of evil, I wanted to bring in 2 books today. There's this book by Dr. Clay Jones, Why Does God Allow Evil? The first 25% of this book I don't like. Because he takes an Augustinian approach, and I think Augustine's approach isn't accurate, nor is it good. However, the second half of this book, and about 75% of it afterwards, is actually pretty good. So, just so you know, if you guys do read this, I actually do like it. I just think the first part has a problem. And he even acknowledges, if you don't agree with this approach, the rest of this will be non-controversial. Okay? And I appreciated that. I'm like, well, at least he acknowledged the fact that other Christians wouldn't agree. This book is good, popular level, easy to read, okay? And like I said, the first chunk you don't have to agree with, but after that it's good.
I was going to ask, can you mark off the ones that we shouldn't read?
Oh, I mean, I would just say you should read it anyway.
Okay.
You should, because I would even say read the part I disagree with, because I want you to know why I disagree with it.
No.
Does that make sense? Like, once you get to it, I want to see if the flags go off. Right, that causes a problem, I feel like.
We can learn from just reading.
Right, and you can learn from it where there's like there's 2 major Christian responses. Jordan here actually taught a class on it. Maybe at the end of this I might have you do it one more time, because there's 2 views of God that are very prevalent. There's like a more Augustinian and Reformed view, and then which presupposes a more incoherent view, and then the rest of the views, which I would argue is more orthodox, which is a more coherent view. So, but maybe we can go through. Would you be opposed to doing it again?
No, I'd be happy to do it again.
Okay.
Just to quote James White,
Oh,
just
gosh.
every now and then, blind squirrel finds a nut. James White says, the light of truth shines brightest against the backdrop of error. So if you read the Augustinian view, it's kind of like, when somebody says, can God make a rock so big he can't move it? And then you're like, well, what you're saying is that God can do what is logically contradictory and create a square circle. So the error shows you the truth. So if you read the Augustinian solution to the problem of evil, and you see the erroneous and the erroneous view and how it has the exact same assumption that the atheists have about the problem, the Epicurean problem of evil, that erroneous view allows you to see the correct view much more clearer.
Right, because the Augustinian view and the atheist view both presume a logically contradictory view of God, that he can be incoherent, and that
his omnipotence.
Yeah, that with his omnipotence, that he can literally do anything. And I don't think it's biblical, because God cannot lie, for example, right? So we will discuss that as we go forward. Another one for you more heavy readers is this book, The Evidential Argument from Evil. This is a book that has atheists and Christians arguing against each other in various essays. Now, I will say this, it's more of a technical read. There's a few chapters that are a little bit easier to read, and then there's other ones where it's like, okay, hold on. I just want to show you the example because I laughed at it. I was like, are you kidding? Yeah, here's a good example. They bring in, would you believe, they bring in math into a philosophy book? It's garbage, man. I didn't come here for division. And it's like all with propositions. But it is a good book. It is a bit heavy, but there are a few in here, like the chapter by, I think, William Rowe, as an atheist, he presents his case well. However, I think Richard Swinburne in here absolutely demolishes him, who's a Christian. But it's a good book. But this is if you want something a bit more substantive. That would be good. Also, but if you just want like, hey, look, I want a really basic overview, I'd say this one. But remember, the beginning part is Augustinian, and we will address that in this class where the problem lies. Okay. So that is part 1. Because next time, part 2, we're going to get to incoherent arguments.
Can I just say a couple things real quick?
Yeah,
So
do your thing.
if you want to read something and you have a Kindle, where the word theodicy comes from is from Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. He's the guy that invented calculus. He wrote a book called Theodicy. And a lot of the arguments that are still used today are in that book. And it's really long and not really easy to read, but if you just read like the first half, you'll get a whole bunch of the arguments that are still used today. And after you read Theodicy, after you read Leibniz, if you've ever heard the saying, you're looking at the world through rose-colored glasses, that comes from Voltaire's book, Candide, which was written as a direct response to Leibniz. And when you read Theodicy first, and then you read Candide, you will laugh all the way through Candide. Voltaire just lampoons Leibniz, and it's hilarious.
So a theodicy, and just so you guys know, theodicy is a fancy word, because you know theologians, we like fancy words. Like Bible interpretation, we call hermeneutics, right? God's unchanging nature, his aseity. You know, like we have all these fancy words. Now, theodicy is just a response. Is what it is. It's a defense of the Christian faith. Okay, that's what a theodicy is. It's just an answer to a question to defend the Christian faith or to defend theism. Okay.
So the guy who created calculus
Yeah, Leibniz.
was the one that he was a Christian?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there were two people that
Christians are smart.
came up
I know.
with calculus at the same time. So most people, that's kind of an argument. If Leibniz invented calculus first, or who's the other guy? Well, I can't think of his name, but they give more credit to the other person for having invented calculus. But Leibniz was a very intelligent guy, and like there's college classes that just go through that work of Theodicy by Leibniz. And like I said, Candide, if you haven't read Leibniz, when you read Candide, you're like, this is sick and twisted. But if you read Theodicy first and then you read Candide, it's a comedy. It's really,
You
really
read one,
funny.
it's twisted. So read one before the other, and make it a good time as
It's
opposed to a
really
frustrating
funny.
time.
Yeah, I laughed out loud reading Candide.
So actually, I should read Candide. Actually, I haven't read Candide. So yeah, and next week, what you can expect to see is we're going to quickly review the paradoxes again. We're going to go through the 3 main laws of logic. Okay, the law of identity, law of non-contradiction, law of excluded middle. And then we're going to start going through theodicies, different defenses for the Christian faith, okay? Including free will theodicy, heaven theodicy, all the theodicies, okay? So is this was this a decent intro to kind of get your minds kind of like percolated on what we're going to be discussing in the future, okay? Cool, very good. You guys see how it's important? Can you guys also see where some of the misses are happening in Christianity? Good. Because I want our church to be equipped properly. So, good. If you have any questions or concerns or insults, let me know.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
You talk as atheists are bad people. They just don't know.
Oh.
They just don't know.
Oh, I wouldn't say
understand.
I wouldn't say an atheist is a bad person, any more than the rest of us. No, I'm saying I'm using it as a philosophical argument. So what I'm saying is that the philosophical questions that they bring up. So I try to make a distinction between people and ideas. So what I'm saying is that the ideas that they will levy against us to say we have an incoherent view are actually causing problems. So I'm only dealing with it in a sense of like what we could say a formal debate sphere, where some of these things are ideas that are levied, and Christians actually have no good ideas back sometimes. So I'm just trying to deal with the ideas themselves separate from the people. But atheists, there are some nasty internet atheist types, or people like Sam Harris, of course. But not all atheists are bad. Some atheists just don't know, and mainly because Christians haven't had a good response to them, which is why we're doing this class, because I want Christians to have a good response to atheists so we can win more atheists to Christ, because maybe they just haven't had a good reason to join, to believe. I actually believe, I'm in what we call an evidentialist. I believe that evidence, we make our decisions based on evidence, and we should. And I think atheists, if they're truly open, are presented with the right amount of evidence, they can change their mind. Now granted, sometimes it's just a prickling of the Holy Spirit, and that's the evidence that the person needed. Other times, these people have been wrestling deep issues, and you have to start working your way through them. So, does that make sense? So, sorry if I came off that way. It's not my intent. So, hope that clears that up.
Yeah.
But a lot of them, you're right, they don't know, and I think we should know how to respond to them. Any other comments? Are we excited about this class? 'Cause I'm jazzed about this class. So, cool. All right, guys, thank you so much. We'll do part 2, incoherence arguments and intros to theodicy next week. It'll be fun.